Hey guys, it's me, Strum. I'm going to actually be doing something today that I've never done on this channel, which is just a straight talking video where I am talking about something music related rather than sharing music directly. So I'm going to be talking about what you're seeing on your screen right now, which is a picture of the album cover of Tubular Bells 2003. As in, I'm talking about the album, not the actual album cover, although it is very pretty. I worded that very weirdly, but I'm talking about the album, and I'll give you a little brief reason why. I really like this album, and I almost never see people talking about it. Tubular Bells 2003 is something that's not talked about much in the review circles on YouTube. So this is me doing that because I believe that it deserves it. So here we go. What is Tubular Bells 2003? Well, Tubular Bells 2003 is a re-record of a 1973 album called Tubular Bells. Now, if you don't know about Tubular Bells, in 1973, well, really starting in 1972, an English musician named Mike Oldfield, who had gotten to work with some bands that were semi-well-known at the time, he got to record this album, and what it was a lot of melodies that he'd had in his head for a long time, a lot of melodies he'd had with him. He'd recorded some of them in a demo, and what he ended up doing was taking these melodies and putting them together in this very self-expressive long piece of music, which we now call Tubular Bells, which is split up into two parts. So it's two very long musical tracks, equaling about 50, as in 50 minutes of total music. And the interesting thing is he used rock instruments and some more classical instruments. So of course he used tubular bells, which are not usually associated with rock music, but he also used electric guitars, and he used mandolin and reed and pipe organ and glockenspiel and some drums in part of the album too. And it's very unique and very interesting, and it spoke to a lot of people, as in the emotions that Mike Oldfield conveyed in the album came across to a lot of people, and they really appreciated it for that. It has a very kind of 70s feel to it, but it also has this kind of emotional complexity that you don't see from a ton of music that you would call popular music. And of course, kind of elephant in the room, this album exploded as far as its popularity in 1973 because of a little old film called The Exorcist. A lot of people think that Mike Oldfield was like involved in that movie somehow. He really wasn't. He recorded this album in 1972, I think, a lot of it, and then he the first part he recorded in 1972, I think, and then in 1973 he got to do the part two, but like that was released in May, and that film didn't come out until December of 1973, right? So he got a phone call from Richard Branson, and actually this album is what launched Virgin Records into existence, right? Virgin Records started as a record sales business, but then Mike Oldfield's album Tubular Bells was the first album sold by Virgin Records, so you can thank Mike Oldfield for that. But yeah, so I think the album was selling decently well before that and was becoming pretty well known, or at least decently well known in Britain. But then after The Exorcist dropped in 1973, a lot of people heard that opening piano tune, a lot of people heard that piano tune in that film, and you might know that just from seeing that, and they wanted to hear the full record. So that is Tubular Bells from 1973. So what's the deal with this Tubular Bells 2003 deal? Well, for whatever reason, and I don't remember specifically what it was, Mike Oldfield was not able to go back and re-record this album, which he wanted to do. And the reason was, this album was revolutionary and it sounded great and it has its charm, but there were certain things, especially in part one, that Mike Oldfield was just not particularly happy with, because I think he had to record the whole thing in like a week. It was very much a situation where it's like, we'll let you use the studio, not like take as much time as you need type thing, because this was his debut album. So, he made some mistakes on the album. Like you can hear, he says this himself, you can hear him making some mistakes. You can hear certain things, like you can hear him breathing sometimes on the record. Like, there are just little things, little imperfections that a lot of people really like, and Mike himself still likes the first part of that original 1973 album, but there are just certain things he always wanted to kind of redo, and kind of redo the whole thing. So he did in 2003, because I think it was 30 years exactly that he got the rights to do that. I don't really know the exact legal reason, but he did. And I think what he said at the time was Tubular Bells 2003 was the way Tubular Bells was supposed to sound, right? So he released this album in 2003. We have the re-recorded Tubular Bells. And how is it? Well, I gotta tell you, I first heard this album and heard this Tubular Bells, like the whole thing, in 2013, I think. And I think that same year I heard Tubular Bells, 2003. So I didn't have to live with Tubular Bells for 30 years before I heard Tubular Bells 2003. So my reaction to this is going to be different than a lot of fans' reaction. But a lot of people didn't particularly like it. And one of the things they cited was that the album sounded too robotic, too fake, not very... it doesn't have that same charm that the original album had. And I'll tell you, the first time I heard this record, I kind of thought a little bit of the same thing. I could see why people were saying that. But there was something else, too, that I realized quickly. Okay, if you want this album to be a replacement for Tubular Bells, it's never going to be the same, right? Because Tubular Bells is its own thing. It has its own charm. It's its own product of its own time, right? That's just kind of the nature of remaking things. A remake is never going to be the same, even if you say this is what I intended at the time, right? Tubular Bells is what it is, and that album is a good album. But Tubular Bells 2003, I think if you're looking for it to be a replacement, you're going to be disappointed. But if you look at it as a really good cover of Tubular Bells that's made by the same artist, then I think you're really going to like it. And here's why. This album does things the original didn't and probably couldn't, as far as sonic clarity. It has a lot of very clear instruments, very clear instrumentation. It has more computerized sounds in it as well. It has some like MIDI instruments in it. They're still very high quality, but they are computerized, right? And it has a level of production and scope that the original couldn't have, right? So sometimes in the original, you'll hear like a piano, right, just playing, and it sounds like a piano playing in a room. In Tubular Bells 2003, you might hear something, and it sounds like a piano that's played, but it's very highly produced, and it has complex echo effects, and maybe there was a synthesizer that rose, and then it led to like a bell toll and a piano hit. But in the 2003 version, it'll be like a crash and like a choir or something like that. And a lot of people took issue with that, right? And I can see why if they were trying to have a replacement album. But guys, I'm telling you, this record sounds so pristine. It sounds so nice when you listen to it. And if you approach it that way, I think you're going to really like it. Dare I say, if you've never heard the original Tubular Bells, you might even want to start with Tubular Bells 2003, which a lot of people would probably consider blasphemy to say that. But I mean, all the same melodies are there, all the same timing. It's just there's some extra instruments added in. There's some parts that were done that sounded good, but they were kind of rough, and now they sound very well produced, right? And not necessarily overproduced, but very well produced, like cinematic, right? And I really dig that, because Tubular Bells does have some really good melodies, but it's not as accessible because some people might not want to sit through almost an hour of music that sounds a little bit erroneously played, and this, I think, album is more accessible. This album is so sparkly and so kind of shiny sounding, if that makes sense, that I would recommend listening to this. Like, this is one of those albums I would say, you probably don't want to listen to this on vinyl. You probably want to listen to this with good speakers, and you probably want to, if you don't have the CD, at least get yourself like a good like iTunes version of it or something, where you're going to be able to hear those details, because it is really gorgeous. It really is. And if you like listening to music that took a lot of different instruments and winds them together through all different kinds of genres, where you might have shredding guitar and you might have some very soft and sad symphonic pieces, and then you're going to like something really weird and wild, like if you want that kind of thing, If you want to hear Vivian Stanchel in the original, I always get those two mixed up, and I apologize. Vivian Stanchel of the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band introduced some instruments in the ending of the first part in the 1973 version. In this version, if you want to hear John Cleese, also known as Nearly Headless Nick in the Harry Potter series, if you want to hear John Cleese introduce some instruments as they play and use a little bit of charm, you know, if you want to hear Mike Oldfield making caveman noises that sound like they're in surround sound and chanting with like a choir of cavemen, if you want to hear all that stuff with some rock and roll bits mixed in, I would say listen to Tubular Bells 2003. It's absolutely, it's great. It's a great album. I would give it at least an 8. But, you know, it's not talked about very often. I like both versions of the album. There was the original 1973 one. There's actually a lot of remasters of that 1973 one. But then there's this Tubular Bells 2003 version. And I think it's, just as good if you appreciate it for what it is. And that's why I think this album absolutely rocks. And I wanted to talk about it today. Thank you guys very much for listening to my video. If you've heard this album, tell me what you think down below. If you think you might want to check it out, let me know because I'd love to hear that too. Anyway, I will talk to you guys next time. Have a great day. Bye-bye.